these tribal people and their relation with the forest. So, moreover, laws were passed by the Nizam government in the areas under its control. During the Nizam's period, Nizam government restricted the rights of the tribal people and restricted the use of forest. So here Nizam government converted the forests into two types. One is a reserved forest, another is a protected forest. Right? Here reserved forest in which no one is allowed. It is a prohibited area. Right? Whereas a protected forest, it is also what to call allowed. The tribal people are allowed to the protected forest with certain limitations. In protected forest, they are allowed. Who are allowed? Tribal people are allowed. Instead, for their use, they can cut trees and they can take their cattle for grazing instead. So this was a thing done by the what to call Nizam government instead. And large number of people lived in these forests. They depended upon the forest. So the government at that time during Nizam's period, they did not really care them. When the government was making certain acts on forest, it was needed for government to define what to call what is forest instead. So which is to be called a forest instead? That was the question to the government instead. So here it is that the government thought the land used by the tribals as the land of the government. The government defined the forest as the lands used by the tribals as a forest, and that belongs to government because the tribal people did not get any ownership rights from the government like we people, as we are living in our plain areas, we have ownership rights on the land because there is a record and we have certain papers, documents showing that we have ownership rights on the lands. Whereas the tribal people were not possessing any document, any records of ownership. So, based on this reason, the government declared forest area is that area which is used by the tribal people and that belongs to government. Okay, so most of the tribals cultivated forest lands in the forest without any ownership records. If you look at in our Telangana, we find Gonds. They cultivated settled agriculture at one place. They settled and cultivated. Whereas columns, these are the two tribal races, Gonds and columns. Gonds, they cultivated settled agriculture, means living at one place what you call as with a stability, whereas the columns practiced Podu cultivation, the two on the slope of hills. Okay, even the Gonds we see who the Gonds what you call who practiced a settled type of agriculture were habitat to the what you call leaving the lands of fallow and cultivated alternated lands. Actually, Gonds also they were moving one place to another place. See, the Gonds who practiced a more settled type of agriculture were in the habit of leaving lands fallow and cultivating alternate lands in 2 year cycle. Here we see what these Gonds who practiced settled agriculture, they too also shifted one area to another area after turning the cultivable land as a fallow land for every 2 years. So this is the thing, and this led to what you call decreasing the forest much more. Here we see that the demarcation of reserve forest did not take notice of the practice of the Gonds. So the forest definition made by the government removed the rights of the tribal people and forced the tribal people to evict from that area. In one stroke, what happened, in one stroke, tribal people turned to homeless in their own homes, that is forest, to add to it. In addition to this, government also very much eager to hand over those lands which were owned by the tribal people to jamindars and cultivators who belongs to other areas, and the government thought that they could settle down and cultivate the lands which were belonging to the tribal people that were given to the jamindars and cultivators, and they could pay revenue to the government. The government decided to give tribal people lands to the jamindars and cultivators, and these jamindars and cultivators were not belonging to forest area, they belongs to other area. So why did government decided like that? The government thought that these people could settle there and cultivate the lands and pay revenue to the government. This is the second point the government did. The evicted tribal people, that means the tribal people who lost their ownership rights on the land, they were forced, understand, they were forced to what you call this work in what you call under jamindars. Okay, tribal people were forced to work in the lands of these jamindars, understand. That means jamindars and cultivators who belongs to other area, understand, who belongs to other area, they what to call turn to the owners of the lands, and it was tribal people were allowed to cultivate the lands and taking on rent and pay revenue to the government. So often we see tribal people had borrowed money from the moneylenders to take land on rent, and that was a large amount. In the end, they had to sell off their lands to the moneylenders as they were not able to pay the rent. So they again lost whatever the land they had, tribal people. Understand? Here we see the forest department, which was established in this period, had a task of protecting the forests and planting the new trees. The government in that period created a special department for the forest, that is called forest department. So this forest department, it was established with a work to protect that forest and plant new trees. It also had some responsibility of harvesting the forest. That means what to call improving the forest. That is felling mature old trees and selling them to earn money for the government. There is a responsibility on the forest department to cut old trees and sell them in the market to earn money from government. There is responsibility on the forest department not to cut the young one. Old trees were allowed to cut by forest department. Understand? So that was the responsibility on the forest department which is created. Forest department officials, they belong to some distant places and rich communities, that is forest officers. They did not know the tribal people as what to call innocent. Understand? They felt that the tribal people are dangerous, so that they did not show any sympathy on tribal people. This forest department exploited the helpless tribals and cheated them, constantly harassed them. In the name of forest conservation, large scale eviction occurred from 1920s to and till 1940. It means from 1920 to 1940, forest department officials, they have harassed the tribal people, cheated them, they did not show sympathy on them. In this way, from 1920 to 1940, most of the tribal people were evicted from their lands. And this created an atmosphere of unending insecurity. Tribal people felt that there is no security to them by the forest department. That created what to call a kind of conflict between tribal people and forest department. So tribal people protested those activities of the forest department and started fighting against cheating to them, against injustice occurred to them. Very beginning it started. In some regions like northeast, certain tribal people were able to win and protect themselves from the government. Understand? So after the independence, this was at a British time. At the time of independence, our national leaders, after getting independence, national leaders were discussing that what was the better way for tribal people who left alone and how to protect the traditional lives in the forest. Should they be made to adapt to settled agriculture? Modern education should be given, or whether they should be evicted from forest and provide industrial work. So there was a discussion among the top leaders at the time of independence what should be done for forest and the traditional lives, that is tribal people. That was a question uh, stirring in the minds of the what top leaders instead, right? So here we looked at this time some changes have come from 1988 to 1999. Okay, by 1988 the government has realized that the development of tribal people could not be thought of without giving them any rights over forest. That means if they were removed from the forest, then there won't be development of the tribal people. That is the point what to call realized by the government. Government realized that tribal people should be given development, and they can't develop without giving ownership rights to them over forest. That is the point the government got it. And the government also understood that protection of forest was impossible. Forests cannot be protected without the tribal people. That means tribal people are essential, and their relation to forest also is essential. Then only the forest can be protected. So without them, forest cannot be protected. Second point the government understood. First point, government want to see the development of the tribal people, and that cannot be achieved without giving rights to tribal people over forest. First point. Second point, that government thought that forest cannot be protected and it is impossible without the tribal people in the forest instead. So in 1988, the government made a policy on a forest that is called the National Forest Policy 1988. This declared that the main task that should be tribal people with the protection, regeneration, and development of the forest. That means the National Forest Policy, which formulated in 1988, stated that tribal people should be protected. Okay, and forest should be developed and it is regenerated. That means, see, protection, regeneration, development of forest. That with tribal people. It means tribal people are allowed. That means the act, that is what you call the policy. That is National Forest Policy says that tribal people should be allowed into the forest, and they should be given work to protect the forest. They should be given responsibility to regenerate the forest where the forest cover is low. Okay, and they should be given the work to increase the forest cover. That is called protection, regeneration, and development of forest along with tribal people, right? That is the declaration by the National Forest Policy. Okay, and here it also wanted that it also wanted to provide gainful employment to the people living in around the forest. The tribal people should get some employment as per the National Forest Policy 1988. Instead, living in the forest, they should get some employment. The government also thought that village communities, that means certain people and villages which are near to the forest, which are very close to the forest, such villages should be allowed to involve in the forest protection and development of the forest land instead. So village communities living near to the forest are allowed to protect and develop of the degraded forest land, means the forest land which is reduced. Such forest lands have to be increased and developed with the villages, that means village people who are very close to the forest. That is also declared by the forest national forest policy. Instead, it is there. See, village communities living close to the forest in their protection should be allowed instead. And communities, these village communities which are near to the forest also allowed to use the forest for their requirements instead. And forest produce, and there should be active participation in afforestation program. They should participate actively in increasing the forest cover and development of the forest instead. So this was the beginning of an active cooperation, an active what to call cooperation for what to call forest and village communities with the forest department for the revival, restoration, and development of degraded forest. Under this National Forest Policy 1988, the Forest Department and local communities are expected to work uh, with to work collectively in regenerating the forest and planting the trees. So these communities are allowed to use the grass and other minor forest products for their development instead. So as per the National Forest Policy 1988, it says that forest department should, that means forest department and local communities both, they should work collectively for regenerating the degraded forest and planting the trees in the forest area. Understand, these are the what declarations given by the what to call National Forest Policy 1988. Understand. So under this forest policy in Telangana, a program was started called Community Forest Management. What is it? Community Forest Management. Understand? Look at here. Community Forest Management. In short, CFM. This program helped to bring together the forest department and the tribal communities for development of the forest. Understand? So it is the CFM, the program, understand, introduced by the Telangana government for developing the forest. Understand?